Well, hello and welcome to another Soundbite. I'm in fact not Ian Chidlow, but my name's Mungavin. I talk a bit funny because I'm from Northern Ireland. You've been going through a series looking at how God has used particular people to preserve the truth against error, and how he has helped the church to grow by his grace. Today, we're going to be thinking about a chap named Athanasius. He was an Egyptian by birth and ended up as the Bishop of Alexandria, an ancient city formed in the north of Egypt when the Greek Empire was at its height. He was exiled 5 times from Alexandria, but then brought back when everyone calmed down and realized that that was a terrible idea and that they needed him. Because of that, and because Christianity was on a trajectory towards liberalism at the time, and the way the Roman Empire was going, he earned the epitaph Athanasius contra mundum, which means Athanasius against the world. In other words, he was an absolute lad and made a massive contribution to the church. Why is Athanasius worth thinking about for us modern Christians? Well, let me put a question to you. Imagine that you're down at the pub with your mates, and just like me and Ian used to do in college, make sure you ask him about Southgate spoons. And after a couple of pints or tomato juices, if that's your thing, someone remembers that you're a Christian and they decide to put some questions to you. They say, hey, you Christians believe that Jesus is God and man at the same time, right? How is that true? And then, overhearing the question, someone else at the table pipes up. Now, wait a second. How can Jesus be God? I thought Christians only had one God. Wasn't Jesus just like the best and most powerful person that God made? Well, how do you feel in that moment? Maybe you're loving it and you're ready with an answer, or maybe you're like me and you just stare into your pint and wonder what you're going to say. Well, that's why Athanasius is so helpful for us modern Christians. God gave him to the church to help us to think about how it is we can say the true statement that Jesus is both fully God and fully human. And also how it is that we can serve one God, but in 3 persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Athanasius is perhaps most well known for his conflict with Arius and his followers, the Arians. It's worth noting that these Arians are different from the kind who became Nazis in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. This is Aryan with an I, and the Nazis are Aryans with a Y. Arius got into trouble with Athanasius because he had a crack at Athanasius' boss. At this stage, Athanasius was still a deacon in the church. So Arius weighs in against Alexander of Alexandria, who was the bishop at the time, and says that he's teaching heresy because he's claiming that Jesus is the Son of God and fully equal with the Father. Arius claims that Jesus was the first and greatest of God's creations, of a higher order than humans, but not fully divine himself. Basically, that Jesus was a created being rather than the uncreated creator. Now, the problem was that Arius wasn't just a lone nutter wearing a tinfoil hat by himself. He'd managed to spread his views far and wide through the Christian church. Well, how did he do that? It was before Twitter and TikTok and Instagram, but his method wasn't much different. He used sea shanties. Now, imagine everywhere you go, instead of singing, "Soon may the weller man come to bring us sugar and tea and rum," everyone was singing something like, "Jesus the created one, who God made first and called him his son," or something like that. It's catchy and it spreads, and soon everyone starts believing that Jesus was the created one who the Father made first and called him his son. Athanasius was one of the key voices at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. He was still just a deacon at this time, but he was very important in the theological debate that went on, and at subsequent councils as well. He was so important because this was the council where they first began to tackle the challenge of Arianism, that Jesus was just created and was somehow lesser than the Father. This was the period of church history where God was using Athanasius and others through his Holy Spirit to guide the church into a truer understanding of what he is like in himself. The main thing that came out of those councils was our understanding that Jesus is of the same substance or nature as God. The fancy Greek word that they use is homoousios. They're of the same substance. Athanasius was also key in defining the relationships within the Trinity, the Father as the unbegotten one, the Son as the begotten, and the Spirit as the one who is breathed out by the Father and the Son. So if you were to go back to your friend in the pub, you could clarify that Jesus wasn't created by God, but he is God, co-eternal and co-equal with the Father, because he shares the same substance. One of Athanasius' famous works is called On the Incarnation. He wrote it as preparation for the Orthodox party at the Council of Nicaea. And that famous Irishman, C.S. Lewis, who wrote The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, wrote an introduction to the modern translation of it. In his introduction, C.S. Lewis says that people are often afraid to read great ancient authors because they feel inferior to them and not up to the task. It's much easier to listen to fellas like me chat about them. But what you find as you crack into the great writers like Athanasius is that they're often much simpler and easier to understand because they're so clever, and they never indulge themselves by singing sea shanties. Also, because they've mastered their subject, they can speak really simply about it. So if you want to know more about Athanasius' contribution to the church and how God used him to guard the truth, why not pick up a copy of On the Incarnation and hear from the man himself about the amazing riches of when God became man. This will do your heart good to read this book. Here's a little highlight to whet your appetite. Athanasius writes, "He, Jesus, became what we are so he might make us what he is. He became what we are so he might make us what he is." Why did God become man? What we are? So that he might make us righteous, what he is. That's a really important truth to protect. And here's why. Because if Jesus wasn't God, then the sin of all who believe couldn't be paid for. Only the sin of one person could be paid for because Jesus would only be a human. Here's Athanasius again. He says, the Word, that's Jesus, perceived that corruption could not be got rid of otherwise than through death. Yet he himself, as the Word, being immortal and the Father's Son, was such as could not die. For this reason, therefore, he assumed a body capable of death. He became man, in order that, through belonging to the Word, who is above all, might become in dying a sufficient exchange for all, and itself remaining incorruptible through his indwelling, might thereafter put an end to corruption for all others as well, by the grace of the resurrection. Athanasius died in around 373 AD. It wasn't in violence or in martyrdom. He wasn't executed. It was in peace. He had faced 5 unjust exiles in his life, but he was finally able to finish the race in Alexandria, where he had served as bishop for 43 years, 17 of which had been in exile. Now, he's remembered not just because he made such an important contribution to theology. He did that, and God used him mightily to preserve the truth for us and to enhance our understanding of what God is like in himself, but also because of his godly character. Another early church father said of him not long after he died, "When I praise Athanasius, virtue itself is my theme. For I name every virtue as often as I mention him who was possessed of all virtues. He was the true pillar of the church. His life and conduct were the rule of bishops, and his doctrine the rule of the orthodox faith." Athanasius showed us that it is important to be precise in what we believe about God. It's important to know true things about God, but that it's also important to imitate Christ in our way of life. May God bless you as you consider the works of Athanasius on the Trinity and the incarnation, and may he bless you as you seek to imitate Athanasius' godly way of life.